The last 48 hours have turned the world upside down, or maybe the other way around, right side up. Trump is destroying Iran. Negotiations seem to have collapsed. The ceasefire has been canceled. Missiles, drones, mines, threats of a nuclear attack. Will Iranian missiles with radiological warheads be launched toward Israel? Russia is quietly supplying Iran with spare parts. Iranians are being killed en masse in Iraq. It was quite a complicated weekend in the world. It just ended. In other words, over the past 48 hours, the world has become noticeably more dangerous. The IRGC shelled commercial ships passing through the strait. The U.S., under the cover of night, escorted about 200 oil tankers right under Iran's nose. In response to this, the U.S. launched massive strikes on critical facilities in Iran after Iran's shelling. In response, Iran announced its withdrawal from the agreement and effectively buried the ceasefire regime. Israel is blowing up underground cities built by Iranians for Hezbollah. At the same time, as I already mentioned, Iraq is conducting combat operations and actions against forces linked to Tehran. And over the Middle East, the clouds of a new war are literally gathering. Iran has actually stated that it is ready to launch a missile with a real nuclear warhead. In this video, we'll break down exactly what happened over the past 24 hours, why the ceasefire collapsed, and how the logic of drone and missile warfare is changing, and most importantly, what all this could lead to for the US, Israel, Iran, and the whole world. This will be perhaps the most alarming part of the video. We'll discuss how real the threat of Iran using nuclear weapons is, or, well, dirty bombs. Where it could theoretically be launched and what would actually happen if such a missile were intercepted right in the sky, in the air, during its flight. Stay until the end. We will talk not only about the facts, but also about future scenarios in which the Iranian threat will either be completely broken or turn into a catalyst for a major war. Friends, I'm glad to welcome everyone to the channel. If you're here for the first time, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. As you know, it's free, but it really helps promote analytical content in the algorithms. Write in the comments where you're watching from. Los Angeles, Tel Aviv, Moscow, Berlin, Tbilisi, Vilnius, Sydney. Our audience is really spread all over the world. And a small request, write below if you think it's time to act tough, really tough.
Но жестко.
To finally put an end to the Iranian threat? Or do negotiations still make sense? Your opinion is important not only to me, but also to those who read these comments. Believe me, they are being read. Now let's get down to business. So, as of June 29th, the situation looks as follows. Over the past night, the United States carried out a series of massive strikes on targets in Iran. The targets were not chosen by chance. Military intelligence, communication hubs, air defense systems, drone warehouses, missiles, logistics facilities, and troop command centers. This is not a symbolic response like, you hit us, we hit you, an eye for an eye, so to speak, and then everyone goes their separate ways. No, this is a methodical attempt to remove the nervous system from the Iranian military machine. The formal pretext is Iran's attack on commercial vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz. At first, it was like this. One tanker, then a second one, including a vessel under the Panamanian flag with more than 2 million barrels of oil on board. Well, God forbid something happens to that oil. It will start spilling into the water, in the strait. And so, after another attack by a strike drone, the U.S. moved from limited actions to a larger operation. Central Command, that's, well, as you know in the U.S., CENTCOM. They stated that Iran was given a chance to comply with the ceasefire agreement, but Iran did not take that chance. Their language still allows for a return to negotiations, but it's already on the edge. A ceasefire that was already falling apart at the seams. In one night, it became a fiction. Strikes on military targets, retaliatory attacks on U.S. positions in the region. This is no longer an incident. This is a full-fledged stage of escalation. It can still be turned around, smile, wipe it all off, and go back. But now it's far away. In response, Iran undertook what it itself presents as a combined offensive operation. the Revolutionary Guard, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, announced the massive use of strike drones and missiles against 8 U.S. military infrastructure targets in the region. Well, first of all, that's Bahrain and Kuwait. They're not even trying to hide it. In official statements, it's said directly, "We're trying to kill Americans, we're bombing their base," and so on. Footage of missile launches is being published. Strike drones taking off, the night sky, tracers. There are flashes from launches, loud sounds. None of this is training exercises. These are real combat operations. One of the missiles is detected in the air over Kuwait during the exchange of strikes. Iran is demonstratively showing something. What exactly is it showing? We are ready to strike American targets. That means we have both the strength and the capability. We have not been broken. Second, we believe this means the U.S. has violated the ceasefire. It doesn't matter who was first. For, well, in general, so to speak, well, it doesn't matter at all. What matters is that it was the U.S. that violated the ceasefire, and we no longer recognize the framework in which they tried to hit us. That is, in fact, they had been moving toward this moment for quite some time, and they were just waiting for an opportunity for something to break through, and now it has. And it's important to understand that. It's not just about physical damage, it's also a political signal, which, in fact, I would say is addressed to all players, all participants, all players in the region, so to speak if we translate it from English. Yes. Now let's take a look at the diplomatic level. Over the past few months, there was a memorandum of understanding and a ceasefire. Fragile. But it kind of allowed for a greater illusion to be maintained, that the conflict was still manageable. Occasionally easing the situation through negotiations, it's an illusion. And apparently the illusion has collapsed. Whether it happened when Iran wanted it or not doesn't matter now. What matters is that it seems to have collapsed. And once again, it can still be restored. That is, nothing has happened yet. That means it's all over. That's it. But it's already very close to that. Here, the Israeli TV channel I-24 reports that another round of negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, which was supposed to take place in Switzerland, has been canceled. Essentially, the diplomatic track has been put on hold. And not just a technical pause, but a kind of political freeze. It's like everyone is showing each other that they don't care. They say, we can do without these negotiations. We can hit you right now, blast you. Resumption is possible, but not now. Not under the current conditions of missile strikes and shelling of American bases, of course. Well, and accordingly, Iranian positions as well. What does this mean in practice? First of all, if the ceasefire is completely disrupted, only one card remains on the table. There's nothing else. Large-scale combat operations. That is, secondly, the question of the future of the Strait of Hormuz, Iraq, and Lebanon is no longer decided at the negotiating table. It's determined by the strength of the strikes, by the density of fire, by the readiness of the sides to go for something or to reach something, until one side realizes that, well, it's very unprofitable to continue. And here we come to the key point. The ceasefire, which many presented as a diplomatic success, was actually a mistake from the very beginning, because it gave Iran time to regain its strength. I was among those who thought that some kind of agreement could be reached, and I thought that an agreement could be reached, but not just any agreement. I never thought an agreement with Iran was possible. With today's Iran, making a deal is impossible. But I thought that maybe, until our elections, we could hold out and then decide what to do next, depending on the results of those elections. So, I'll say it right now. What I'm about to say won't be very pleasant for those who believed in the peace process. According to a high-ranking official from the U.S. Department of Defense, since the end of the bombing campaign on April 7, Iran has been actively moving its air defense systems and missile complexes to the area of the Hormuz Strait. They were moving all their belongings there, understanding that this is their only one there, and, well, it's not very effective. It would be effective, so to speak, but a bottleneck where they can put pressure, painfully pressure the world. The equipment was being moved, camouflaged, and dispersed across the islands there. Keshem, Sarik. And along the coastal areas, of course, which had already been subjected to strikes. And simply, so to speak, instead of the destroyed ones, they brought in replacements from other areas. So while the diplomats were talking about a ceasefire, The Iranian military were engaged in classic military craft, mainly restoring damaged systems, deploying new batteries there, logistics for missiles and drones, strengthening key points. But I just want to say that the Americans were doing the same thing. Moreover, according to sources, Iran was actively receiving help from China and Russia, not in the form of direct involvement, as we all know, in combat operations, but through the supply of components, technologies, and weapons. That is, all of this together made it possible not just to return to the original state, and maybe we don't know for sure. Maybe it even partially improved Iran's capabilities. That is, everything from the whole country has been moved here, the last bastion. Thus, the truce became a window of opportunity for Iran. The U.S. stopped the strikes, but Iran did not stop its restoration and modernization. Only very foolish people could have assumed that they wouldn't do this. Now, the key geographic choke point, a huge one. The Hormuz Strait. From the perspective of the global economy, this is an artery through which a huge flow of oil and gas passes, and all kinds of agricultural fertilizers as well. From Iran's perspective, this is leverage over the whole world. And at the same time, it's a zone they claim to control as their own. You know, it's like when, let's say, bandits used to build a small fortress on a river, and they would shoot at everyone passing by, and they'd say, "Pay tribute or we won't let you through." Well, the idea is absolutely the same. Iran has made it clear the strait must be completely open and free for passage, but only on our terms. So this is not an international waterway. This is our strait. Why? Because that's what we want. In practice, this means if ships follow Tehran's requirements, they pass. But if not, they can be detained, attacked, damaged, and so on. There have already been strikes on commercial ships in the strait, as you all know, including those who tried to go through the Omani part. There is Oman on one side and Iran on the other. The Iranians are now trying to negotiate with Oman on how to cooperate. That's it. That is, many were going on the side, so to speak, as far as possible from the Iranian coast, closer to Oman. But nevertheless, Iran attacked them. The U.S. response: strikes on anti-ship missile positions and drones that were used to attack tankers. It is in this context that the destroyed newest Iranian anti-ship cruise missile Talia appears on the screen. Well, like Talia, right? She means something else, not Talia, right? It's a shot of the destroyed system which just yesterday could have attacked large vessels in the strait. This is not just an attack, it's an image. This is the U.S. showing how they are knocking out Iran's teeth, the ones it uses to bite global trade. At the same time as the events at sea and in the sky, another no less important story is unfolding in Iraq. The reports coming from there speak of large-scale military operations against politicians and forces that are supported by Iran or support Iran. Special forces, Iraqi, armored vehicles, tanks in the streets, nighttime shootouts. This is no longer just a struggle between intelligence agencies. This is a violent push to squeeze out Iranian influence from Iraqi politics. As an example, here's footage from the Plaza Hotel district. Right now, it's engulfed in flames. Explosions can be heard. There's fighting going on. According to reports, the Iraqi prime minister is cracking down on politicians suspected of having close ties with Iran. And this is a very important point. The war between the U.S. and Iran is no longer just an exchange of strikes on military targets. It is turning into a struggle for who controls the political elites in key territories. We're talking about Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. As we can see, the United States is surrounding Iran with its allies in territories that they are clearing of Iran's influence. Just as Iran used to try to surround Israel with a ring, today Israel and the United States are surrounding Iran with a ring. And now we come to another potential flashpoint, Lebanon. Early reports indicate that Israel may have carried out an airstrike on targets in southern Lebanon. Lebanon has repeatedly been described as a red line, and any serious intervention there automatically triggered a response from Iran and Hezbollah. It's important to understand here. Hezbollah is not just a political force. It is an armed organization with heavy weaponry, rockets, and combat experience. According to a number of analysts, security agreements between Israel and Lebanon could provoke a civil war within Lebanon. Hezbollah openly declares its readiness to escalate if it feels its positions are threatened. Commander of CENTCOM, General Brad Cooper, reportedly intends to travel from Israel to Lebanon to discuss security mechanisms under the framework agreement. The formation of the so-called Trilateral Committee to monitor the implementation of the agreement is being discussed. A trilateral committee, Lebanon, Israel, Lebanon, not Hezbollah, not Iran. So Lebanon, Israel, and the United States. But against the backdrop of rockets, drones, explosions, and canceled negotiations, any agreement seems extremely unstable. There are also agreements, Lebanon, the United States. This is being canceled, which frees the hands of the Israelis and allows the American armed forces to help Israel, both by supplying weapons and by directly participating in operations against Hezbollah. So, in this sense, it frees Israel's hands and may have a very positive effect on the further existence of Israel in general and the coexistence of Lebanon and Israel. And now, something that wasn't in the previous analyses, and which is critically important for understanding the whole picture, the positions of the three largest external players, starting with Europe. Europe does not speak with one voice in this war, and that in itself is telling. France, Germany, and Britain, in the first hours after the start of the operation, issued a joint statement condemning specifically the Iranian strikes on countries in the region. That is, they formally sided with the logic that Iran is the aggressor. At the same time, President Macron separately stated that France cannot approve of strikes carried out outside the framework of international law, placing the main responsibility on Iran, but at the same time sending military equipment to the Mediterranean Sea. That is, France is simultaneously criticizing the form of actions and increasing its own military presence in the region. Britain has taken such an intermediate, in-between position, right? Prime Minister Starberg, who is already, so to speak, our outgoing Prime Minister, convened an emergency meeting of the Cobra Committee and stated that London does not want further escalation or a broader regional conflict. But at the same time, he emphasized that Iran must not be allowed to develop nuclear weapons. The Brits finally woke up, and he sent Typhoon fighter jets to protect American and Allied bases in Qatar, while formally not participating in the strikes themselves. But in Eastern Europe, the situation is much more clear-cut. Czechia, Poland, and the Baltic states have openly supported the U.S. and Israel. The president of Czechia, Pavel, directly condemned Iran's support for Russia's war in Ukraine. The Estonian foreign minister called the death of Iran's supreme leader a strategic blow to the Russian-Iranian alliance. Finland even drew a direct parallel. Iran supplied drones and missiles for Russia's war against Ukraine, and its own weakening is perceived in Helsinki and Tallinn as a weakening of Russia's military machine itself, which of course is very positive from their point of view. Hungary, as usual, turned out to be a special case. The Prime Minister expressed concern not about geopolitics, but about oil prices. He stated that the escalation doubles the importance of the Druzhba oil pipeline, which passes through Ukraine. That is, this is a characteristic example of how even among formal NATO allies, the reaction to the same crisis is dictated by completely different national interests. Poland has taken the most pragmatic position. Defense Minister Kosiniak-Kamysz said directly that Warsaw is not participating in the operation against Iran, and he warned that a prolonged conflict in the Middle East could jeopardize arms supplies to Ukraine, and at the same time give Russia an economic advantage due to rising energy prices. That is, Poland views the Iranian crisis exclusively through the lens of how all this will affect the war, which directly affects Poland itself. Like, well, okay, this interests us and this doesn't really interest us, or at least interests us less. The general conclusion about Europe: there is no unified position. Western Europe. That's France and Germany. They nominally criticize the methods while supporting the goal. Eastern Europe, Poland, the Baltics, and the Czech Republic see this conflict as a continuation of the war against Russia, by weakening its ally, and almost all European capitals are simultaneously worried about oil prices and the risk that the Middle East will divert attention and resources away from Ukraine. Russia's position. If in Europe we see a spectrum of positions, Russia's position is extreme. It's consistent and predictable from the very first hour of the conflict. The Russian Foreign Ministry called the strikes by the US and Israel deliberate, pre-planned, and not unprovoked. Well, minor details, like people were building an atomic bomb, and they said, as soon as I have it, I'll start throwing it at you. So definitely not unprovoked, and they called it aggression against a sovereign state, saying outright that it was in violation of the basic principles of international law. Moscow's rhetoric was heated from the very beginning. The ministry warned of the risk of a humanitarian, economic, and even radiological catastrophe. And it stated that all responsibility for the unpredictable chain reaction and spiral of violence lies with the United States. Well, and of course the blame goes to the United States, the great Satan, or whatever they call it, the devil, and to the little devil, Israel. It's also worth paying attention to the wording about a radiological disaster. Funny, isn't it? Moscow said it first, before anyone else. Before the topic of nuclear threat became central in the Western media, and this was clearly part of an information strategy to present strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities as something that threatens not only Iran but the entire region through possible radiation release. That is, they started by saying that if you strike these facilities, which Russia helped them build and construct, then something might explode. And then slowly it all turned into the idea that actually Iran might even drop a little bomb on you. Russia, together with China, initiated an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council on the issue of threats to international peace and security. Here are the threats of Russia attacking peace and security. There are absolutely none against Ukraine. This is simply a diplomatic maneuver, an attempt to shift the discussion to a format where the accused parties are the US and Israel, not the Iranian nuclear program. At the same time, and this is an important nuance that analysts point out, both Russia and China did not use their veto power in the Security Council to directly defend Iran. The U.S. permanent representative to the UN directly interpreted this as a sign of Tehran's growing diplomatic isolation. So even they didn't like it when Tehran later stated that, so to speak, they would drop a little bomb on someone. Like, everything is already ready or almost ready, we'll finish preparing it now and we'll drop a bomb on you. They didn't really like that. In other words, the rhetorical support is maximal, but the real and material willingness to stand up for Iran on the international stage, especially if they start waving it around and actually drop it somewhere, is another matter. A dirty one, it doesn't matter what kind, but a bomb, then that willingness just disappears, right? Now China is behaving noticeably more cautiously and restrained than Russia, although their actual positions are quite similar. The foreign minister, Wang Yi, held a series of phone conversations with the Iranian foreign minister, the Israeli foreign minister, and Lavrov, stating more or less the same thing in each conversation. The strikes are not proportionate. UN Security Council sanctions violate Iran's sovereignty. China calls for an immediate cessation of military actions, a return to negotiations, and so on. Beijing emphasized that a military solution does not solve the problem, but creates new long-term and recurring consequences. At the same time, I just want to point out they keep tightening the circle around Taiwan, constantly holding exercises there and saying that they will take over Taiwan. But when others do it, it causes conflict. For us, it's allowed. I mean, we can do it, but they can't. Exactly, everyone does it this way. Who does it differently? A particularly telling phrase was said by Wang Yi in a conversation with, the Israeli Foreign Ministry. China has traditionally advocated for resolving international and regional hotspots through dialogue and consultations. That is, Beijing presents itself as a neutral party that is interested in stability. But here's the thing. They present themselves not as a military ally of Tehran, and we don't know why. Is it because they just want to get involved as mediators? Or are they trying to distance themselves, thinking that, the mullahs and ayatollahs are a bit crazy? At the same time, China expressed a separate, more specific concern about the safety of its citizens and institutions in Iran, and they've built a lot of those there. And they received confirmation from Israel of their willingness to ensure this safety. Like, just mark it on the map, guys, mark the spots, and we won't strike there, so nothing will fly there. That's an interesting detail that shows what Beijing's first priority is. Not ideological solidarity with Tehran, but the protection of their own economic interests and presence in the region. Which is absolutely normal, right? First and foremost, it's about oil contracts and infrastructure projects they've been building there in Iran. The main difference between Beijing and Moscow is that China speaks the language of multilateral diplomacy and international law, whereas Russia speaks the language of direct geopolitical confrontation with the West. But they still inherited this from the Soviet Union and can't seem to let it go, even though it's already a different generation, but still. Both countries equally condemn the strikes, but Beijing does so clearly with the intention of preserving its own reputation as a mediator, not as an ally or as an outside party. Now, the nuclear threat. How realistic is it, really? Well, let's get to the point, the reason many of you have stayed until now. And here I'll try to be as precise as possible with the facts. Because this topic is too serious for speculation, intelligence assessments differ, and here complete honesty is needed. According to the IAEA, as of the end of June, Iran still has 449 kilograms of uranium enriched up to 60%. If further enriched to weapons-grade level of 90%, this amount is theoretically enough to produce 8 to 10 warheads. Previously, they said 10 to 12. I don't know which is more accurate. Technically, with a cascade of about 200 centrifuges, that is, IR-6, it is possible to turn the already accumulated 60% stock into weapons-grade material in just a few days. About 10 days at full capacity for one full weapon's worth. And I'm almost sure that everything they managed to get out of those ruins, they're already processing it now. But there's quite a serious gap between having enough raw materials and having a finished warhead. The director of the IAEA, that's Rafael Grossi, has publicly stated that the agency has no data on a structured, systematic, and methodical program specifically for assembling a finished nuclear device. In other words, there is enriched uranium, but that still doesn't mean a bomb is ready yet. But here it must be said right away, neither he knows nor do we know. According to independent experts, that is the Non-Proliferation Research Center, even with a sufficient amount of enriched uranium, turning it into a working warhead requires months of additional work. Again, we don't know. We do know that in the early 2000s, former Soviet specialists from Ukraine and specialists from Russia went to Iran, and they were working with the Iranians on exactly this. So we don't know how far they've advanced in this matter. That is, manufacturing precise components for an implosive device. Testing and integrating it into a warhead requires knowledge, time, and experience. As for how much of this they have, again, theoretically, they obtained it from the territory of the former Soviet Union, that is, from the Union itself, then from Russia, and from Ukraine. And we don't know how advanced they are. They say, advanced, and we say, we don't know. Whether we believe them or not, I would put it this way. I'd rather believe than say, oh, it can't be. And then, boom, it exploded. After the latest strikes, this is Operation Epi-Hayuri, launched in February. The situation has become even more complicated in terms of verification. On February 28, Iran completely stopped access for IAEA inspectors, turned off surveillance cameras, and removed seals from all declared facilities. Currently, the outside world has no reliable picture. In fact, the world didn't have a reliable picture anyway. Because no one knows what was happening there, in some caves, in some underground sites, and so on and so forth. How many of these centrifuges were delivered to them from Russia, from North Korea, and from Pakistan? Again, no one knows. No one knows where they are. What they showed is what they showed. What they didn't show is what they didn't show. Well, believing is a good thing, so to speak. Yes, believe, but when there's no way to check, and they've already lied 100 times before, it's pretty hard to tell yourself, oh no, of course, this time they're telling the truth, right? So, the biggest verification failure in the history of IAEA's relations with Iran, says the IAEA. In fact, I assure you it was set up from the very beginning. The biggest failure. From what is known about the destruction, the main enrichment plant in Natanz is 75% damaged. Percent means 6,000 centrifuges have been destroyed. The Fordo facility, deeply buried in the mountain, is only 30% damaged. That means its core could potentially remain functional. And the plant in Isfahan is 90% destroyed. And what else and where else, we don't know. Here's an honest answer. As of today, Iran does not have a confirmed, assembled, and ready-to-use nuclear warhead. This is not propaganda. This is a matching assessment from both Western and formerly neutral sources. Threats to wipe each other off the face of the earth, coming from both sides of the conflict, are part of psychological warfare and bargaining, not a description of real proven military capabilities at this point in time. So here there is another risk, which is called a dirty bomb. It seems more realistic. That's why I want to discuss this separately. This is not a nuclear explosion in the classical sense, but rather a conventional explosive device that disperses radioactive material over an area. Well, when it detonates, right? Such a device doesn't require uranium to be enriched to weapons grade 90%. And it doesn't require a miniature implosive warhead that can be mounted on a ballistic missile. A regular 60% stockpile packed together with explosives is enough. Just regular explosives. Experts answer directly, such a device physically won't fit on a ballistic missile warhead. It's too bulky. But it can be transported in a closed truck or on board a cargo ship and brought close enough to the target. That is, the delivery system isn't a missile but a smuggling network, which is much harder to intercept in advance, you have to agree, than a missile launch. The logistical targets for such a threat are not deep military facilities, but highly symbolic crowded locations. A major port hub in the Persian Gulf through which tanker traffic flows, a coalition military base in Bahrain or Kuwait, or in the darkest scenario, an attempt at smuggling and delivering it by sea towards Israel. I want to emphasize this is not a confirmed intelligence plan, but an analysis of the most likely logic behind such an arrangement, if it even exists in an assembled form at all. As of today, I don't have direct evidence of that. What will happen if a ballistic missile with a radioactive payload is intercepted in the sky? And that's a separate point, important for understanding, both technically and, honestly, not just technically. If, hypothetically, Iran did put a radioactive payload on a ballistic missile, as we know, 12 such missiles were transferred to Iran by Kuchma in the early 2000s. Some were sold directly in a secret deal, some to Chinese intermediaries, and then they supplied them to Iran, right? So, if this missile is intercepted by the missile defense system at a high altitude, a nuclear explosion simply won't happen. For that, you don't just need radioactive material, but a functioning device with a chain reaction, which isn't there. But if it's intercepted at a high altitude, then the regular explosive, the normal explosive surrounding the radioactive material, will go off from the impact of the interceptor. And radioactive particles will be dispersed in the upper layers of the atmosphere. Over a huge area, just to be clear, over a huge area, but if they fall, they're concentrated at a single impact point. On one hand, this spreads the radioactive contamination over a much larger area, but at a much lower concentration. Well, like per square kilometer compared to a ground explosion at a single point. So in this sense, interception reduces the local danger for a specific city. But on the other hand, it creates uncontrolled, hard-to-predict radioactive fallout. It's called fallout in English, over a huge area. Possibly over several countries at once, like radioactive rain, depending on wind and interception altitude. What exactly did Russian diplomacy mean when they talked about a radiological disaster? As of today, Iran doesn't seem to have a confirmed combat-ready nuclear warhead. This, as I already mentioned, is the matching assessment of several serious sources. The threat of a dirty bomb is theoretically, technically easier to implement than a full-fledged nuclear weapon. It doesn't require a missile, but rather delivery by smuggling. Now this changes the entire nature of the risk. It's not a question of whether a missile will fly, but a matter of border and port control. In Israel, it's fairly robust and strict, but in other countries, we don't know. The scenario of intercepting a missile with a radioactive payload in the sky doesn't completely prevent a disaster. It just replaces one form of risk with another, a pinpoint strike. But on the other hand, widespread radioactive contamination of a large area. Now let's move to the meta level, to the level of the main technology, globalization. One of the most important trends in modern conflicts. Countries like Iran and North Korea don't necessarily invent technology from scratch themselves. They adapt and copy Western developments. For example, the newest American strike drone, which was lost over Iran during Obama's presidency, was not destroyed. To this day, I still don't understand how that happened, who gave the order not to destroy it. They allowed it to be captured. Why? The Iranians actually reverse engineered it. Reverse engineering. And based on those technologies, they developed their modern drones, which are now flying, on one hand devastating Ukraine, and on the other hand attacking the Americans themselves. Thank you very much, Comrade Obama. Add to that the global leakage of knowledge, publicly available sources, publications, leaks from universities and scientific centers, and a huge number of foreign students in Western universities. For example, right now in Canada, they found several PhD students. That is, doctoral students who were specifically engaged in this. So they studied American, Canadian, and Western technologies in order to take them back to Iran. So that's mainly what they do. For example, China simply sent students, about 10,000 to 30,000, I don't remember the exact numbers were mentioned, graduates who work for their local KGB. Trying to determine how old he is, they came here, enrolled in universities, and moved up. They're good students, they already understand everything. That's why they would quickly surpass Americans and others. They became assistants, were invited to work somewhere, and right during their research, they would steal and send information to China. The same thing happens with Iran as well, though on a smaller scale, of course. Yes, but in Canada, as it turns out, this is highly developed. As a result, it's extremely difficult for Western countries to maintain their technological advantage. You create the latest weapon model, and a few years later, an almost identical one appears in the hands of those you consider your opponents. This explains how Iran was able to quickly build up a fleet of drones and missiles capable of seriously complicating life for an army like the American one. Trump, as president, took a very specific approach toward Iran. On one hand, he threatened to send them to hell. Tonight, an entire civilization will perish. On the other hand, he stated that I love Iran and the Iranian people. He wants to make it great again, and to build a new Middle East, which is true. Many analysts are still trying to figure out what that was. Some think it was chaos, some say it was a deliberate strategy of unpredictability. The left saw only madness in this. They began to closely analyze the course of negotiations and counter-revolutionary processes. It becomes clear there was a certain logic in this apparent chaos, pressure, and bargaining. Today, with Trump back in the White House, the 45th, then a break, now the 47th, his tough, expressive, and highly personalized style is once again becoming a factor, which must be considered when analyzing any situation. He can lash out with threats one day and the next day start talking about a deal, which he says will fix everything. This creates uncertainty, unpredictability, which on the one hand can play into the hands of the U.S., but on the other hand, increases the risk of misjudgment by the opponent. The key question is, what happens next and then after that? In the short term, several scenarios can be identified. The continuation of controlled escalation. The U.S. continues targeted strikes on Iran's infrastructure, air defense systems, communications, warehouses, and missile positions. Iran responds with strikes on bases in the region, on shipping, on U.S. allies. Negotiations are either frozen or taking place against a backdrop of explosions. Well, just as a purely decorative element. The second is a transition to a regional war. If strikes on U.S. bases in Bahrain and Kuwait lead to serious losses, if shipping in the Hormuz Strait is paralyzed, if the fronts in Iraq and Lebanon flare up simultaneously, the conflict will reach a qualitatively different level. It is possible that a much wider range of players will become involved. Israel, obviously, a Persian Gulf state that is currently involved but not involved. NATO, Russia, China, not necessarily directly but through support, supply, intelligence, cyber operations. The third scenario is urgent mediation. At some point, the scale of destruction, rising oil prices, market pressure, and the fear of the elites will force the parties to seek at least a temporary pause. Behind the scenes, negotiations may begin involving European countries, regional allies, and possibly China as a powerful economic player. But for this scenario to become realistic, both sides must recognize that continuing the war is more dangerous for them than a temporary retreat. And as we can see, this is insanely difficult, at least in the case of Russia and Ukraine. I've been talking about this for several months now whenever I'm asked, so what happens next in Russia and Ukraine? So the main thing we need to understand is, we no longer live in a phase of frozen conflict between the US and Iran. We are in a phase of accelerating escalation where the de facto truce has been destroyed. Negotiations have been broken down or postponed. Strikes on each other's targets have become the norm. New areas are getting involved again: Iraq, Lebanon, the Strait of Hormuz. And at the international level, Europe is splitting between those who see this as a threat to their own security and those who are primarily concerned with oil prices and risks. For Ukraine as well. While Russia and China are diplomatically protecting Tehran, they're not doing so actively enough to enter into direct confrontation with the US through the right wing. Of course, we've been through even more dangerous crises. But the combination of drones, ballistic missiles, precision strikes on infrastructure, technology leaks, the weakness of international institutions and the unfinished potential for a radiological incident creates, so to speak, a certain danger, making the current situation uniquely risky. This is not a risk. This is a global explosion. This is the risk of the start of a serious regional campaign using, at the very least, dirty radioactive weapons. And the question I want to ask you is, are we moving toward the final word and collapse of the Iranian regime, or toward a prolonged, costly war with no clear end? If you've watched up to this point, thank you very much. Such long and content-rich episodes require attention and time from the viewer, and I appreciate that. Be sure to write in the comments. Do you support a hardline stance against Iran with the goal of naturally regime change? Or do you think the stakes are too high and we need to return to negotiations at any cost? I read your answers, analyzed them, and often use them as a starting point for my next videos. Don't forget to like, ladies and gentlemen, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss new analytical breakdowns. The bell notifications so you don't miss new analytical breakdowns. Thank you again for being with me. See you soon. And yes, be sure to go to Telegram, find Leon Weinstein US there, which is the same name as the channel on YouTube, and subscribe. I'm there, between the big videos. I post all sorts of ideas, thoughts, and things that happened literally just seconds ago. So you don't have to wait until a big video is made, created, or put together. That's all. Goodbye until next time.